The 7th and 8th rounds of the 2015 Verizon IndyCar Series season would take place at the ever-bumpy and challenging Belle Isle Street Circuit on the outskirts of Detroit. It was now time for the third ever duel in Detroit, but this year was set to be very different than the ones that came before. The new manufacturer-specific body kits had been implemented for this year, and while they were ugly as sin, they had produced some pretty good racing up to this point. But as it turns out, these race cars are race cars, not boats, and that discrepancy would be put on full display this weekend. Reigning series champion Will Power would start race 1 from the pole position, with his Penske teammate Helio Castroneves joining him on the front row. Championship points leader Juan Pablo Montoya, right off the back of a win at the Indy 500 the weekend prior, would start in third, while Venezuelan rookie Rodolfo Gonzalez would be your 23rd and last place starter. Considering the heavy rains that are at the track by the start of the race and the ones that are encroaching rapidly upon the circuit, a 2-hour time limit for the race would be implemented, along with a single file start as opposed to the usual 2-wide formation. With an extra lap under yellow and all the stories taken care of, now we can get to the start of the race. The green flag would fly, and with a sky full of mist, it would be Will Power holding onto the lead and some drivers shuffling around farther behind. Considering that they are essentially driving on a lake, the fact the start was clean was an absolute miracle. Takuma Sato was a pretty hard charger early on, making his way from 4th all the way to the race lead by the start of lap 3. But just as Sato began to pull away, we would get our first yellow of the race. It was Rodolfo Gonzalez who stopped against the inside wall out of turn 2. It was merely a simple spin exiting the corner that got him there in the first place. But with his car in a very precarious spot, the first yellow of the race will come out. During this yellow, we would see two things of note. Drivers were already peeling into the pits, with Luca Filippi coming in for a quick splash and dash. Something else that we saw during this yellow was a welcome sight of sunlight. But with the sun coming out, the chrome horn came out with it. On the lap 6 restart, Stefano Coletti went for a kamikaze dive into turn number 1, hitting James Jakes, who then clouded into Tony Kanaan, with Tony then being hit up the rear by an oncoming Graham Rahal. The crash would take Graham Rahal out of the race on the scene, while Tony went several laps down, having to go back to the garage with suspension damage. James Jakes, meanwhile, got away from that incident with only a broken front wing, eventually coming in to replace it. He still wasn't very happy though, giving the toss or hand sign to the 4 team as he drove down the pits. The track was drying incredibly quickly, as not even 10 laps in, the likes of Marco Andretti and Charlie Kimball had already made the bold decision to switch to dry tires. The race would be restarted yet again on lap 12, and this time the field would make it through that first lap clean. The big storyline at this point was without a doubt the slick runners. Despite the fact they couldn't run off the dry line without having a major accident, the slicks became more and more tempting as the track became drier and drier. Ryan Hunter-Reay was one of the next drivers to come down pit road, which was unfortunate timing. Charlie Kimball, who's one of the slick runners, had just slammed into the wall coming out of turn 2. It was a pretty substantial hit for Kimball, but despite his car being ruined, Charlie was alright. With this crash came yet another yellow, and with this yellow came a flood of drivers down pit lane. With the rest of the field coming down into the pits for dry tires, it would give the lead of the race to Marco Andretti. The race would be restarted on lap 19, and while Marco Andretti began to pull away, Joseph Newgarden and Takuma Sato made contact coming out of turn 7. Newgarden would pick up a puncture, while Sato would pick up some damage on his front wing. Takuma decided not to pit, opting instead for the wait for the front wing to fully break off, then come in to repair it during the ensuing debris caution strategy instead. As it turns out, that's exactly how things would play out. After a brief yellow to retrieve the debris from Sato's car, the race was back underway 24 laps in. At this point, Marco was just hoping for the race to settle into some kind of groove. It had been a stop-and-start affair so far, with the longest green flag stint being only 3 laps. But unfortunately for Marco, that straightforward run to the checkered flag wasn't going to happen. Firstly was yet another debris caution after Roberto Gonzalez hit the turn 14 wall, which came only moments after Tristan Vautier got scared into the wall by Carlos Munoz. But the biggest wrench that was about to be thrown in the works was the incoming second round of rain, which was set to be even heavier than the first. With very ominous clouds above the racetrack, the race was restarted yet again on lap 29. Once more, the first lap back to racing was clean, with the main drama being the game of chicken between Takuma Sato and Sage Karam, with the latter of the two picking up a completely deserved blocking penalty. But not very long after that, debris from Gabby Chavez's car would bring out the 7th yellow of the race. Now the encroaching rain was becoming much more ominous, with some estimates suggesting it was less than 10 minutes away from the racetrack. As such, the teams of Scott Dixon and Helio Castroneves put them on wet tires as a preemptive strike. The race was back underway on lap 34, and with the looming threat of rain, all hell was about to break loose. Marco Andretti would actually lose a lead during this restart, with an engine hiccup coming out of turn number 3 relegating him down the running order. This briefly gave the lead to Jack Hawksworth, but then Hawksworth along with most of the field would come in for wet tires. It was now Will Power running in the lead before he came in too. With all of that, Marco was now back in the lead, and it was looking very good for him. The likes of Elio Castroneves and Scott Dixon had cooked their tires and were starting to feel the pain. Marco, meanwhile, was still lapping fast on the slick tires, leading over Carlos Munoz and Simon Pagenaud, both on slicks as well. But soon enough, Marco found himself in a catch-22, as he had to deal with lap traffic and was at the end of his fuel stint. Despite still feeling very confident on the dry tires, Marco had to switch to the wets during his fuel stop. Pagenaud would follow Andretti in, giving the lead of the race to Carlos Munoz. Munoz had a much better fuel number, and was still making those slick tires work as he dealt with lap traffic. About 3 laps after Marco, Munoz came in as well, but because the slicks were the tire of choice during the laps in which he stayed out compared to Marco, Munoz came out of the pits with a substantial lead over Andretti, 26 seconds to be a bit more precise. But now to go from good news to great news, the rain was here, and it was starting to pick up. Soon enough, the moderate drizzling turned into a full-on shower. But the rain wasn't the major problem yet. What was a major problem was the lightning. The lightning was enough of a problem that it would bring the yellow out, but soon enough insult would be added to injury. As the rain turned into a downpour, and the slow pace of the field turned most of the track into a giant slip and slide, Luca Filippi would end up bearing his car into the turn 1 wall. 48 laps in, the red flag was brought out. The weather had taken a drastic turn for the worse, and with the race over the halfway mark and the rain shower showing no real signs of going away, the result seemed like a foregone conclusion. Thanks to some very well done strategy and a little bit of luck, Carlos Munoz would score his first ever IndyCar win at the 2015 Duel in Detroit race number 1. Marco Andretti, who led the most amount of laps, would come home in a heartbreaking second, with Simon Pagenaud in third, scoring his first ever podium for Team Penske. To say this race was hectic would be a pretty big understatement. Lots of attrition, weather-related shenanigans, and an underdog winner were just some of the storylines to come from a very entertaining race. I actually made a video about this race all the way back in November of 2021, and back then I kinda hated it. I personally feel like that judgment from 16-year-old me was just a little bit unfair. A whole lot has changed since then. After all, I made that video over an eighth of my life ago. I'm now an adult with much lower blood pressure, over 3,000 more subscribers, and over a year of broadcasting under my belt. My perspective on many things has changed dramatically in the past 2.5 years, and my perspective on this race is one of them. This is a kind of race which is a broadcaster's favorite to do. Certainly my favorite kind of race to do. There's never really a dull moment, but you also aren't overwhelmed with all the stuff going on either. There's also a whole lot of color and storylines to follow throughout the race, and yet it's just laid back enough whereby you and your fellow commentators can have a lot of fun. And also, from my perspective, doing this YouTube stuff for as long as I have, this is a kind of race that makes for a pretty good video. Yes, this race may have been a caution fest, and yes, the race being called early was a bit of a damn squib, but despite that, I really enjoyed this race, and I hope you did as well. Thank you all for watching, and have a great afternoon.